Half a millennium ago, Martin Luther chose to nail the summary of the 95 points of contention he had with the church of his day to the local notice board in the middle of his town, the Wittenberg church door. He was ready to take on the world. Luther was nothing if not brave, bold, blunt, and sometimes downright belligerent. Over the last 2 weeks, I've looked at a couple of the mistakes this famous monk made by leaping to conclusions which, with hindsight, we can now see were far more driven by the culture of his day and the struggle he found himself in than any objective reading of the Bible. And we've seen how, in both cases, that unhelpful teaching was eventually picked up and misapplied by future generations. Like I said, bad theology costs lives. So today, what I want to do is reflect on some of what I admire and respect about Martin Luther, the father of the Reformation. For me, Luther's greatest attributes were his curiosity and his courage. The curiosity which allowed him to think outside the box of perceived orthodoxy. The courage which drove him to speak up for what he believed, regardless of the personal cost, which was extremely high, because as we know, the church leaders of his day soon saw to it that he was branded a heretic and then excommunicated. But he was in good company. As the modern day author Seth Godwin wittily remarks, we need heretics to keep faith alive. Heretics are the people of faith who will risk everything to challenge the prevailing religion of the day. By religion, he says, he means the rules and procedures that we put in place around faith. He explains that these rules were originally invented to amplify our faith, to make it easier to be passionate. But over time, the rules always get more solid and the faith wavers. That's why real change, he concludes, can only come from people with belief in the key mission and a healthy disrespect for the bureaucracy that has grown up around it over time. Take the case of Jesus himself. The scribes and Pharisees never liked the way that he ignored their time-honoured interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. As far as they were concerned, his views and beliefs, habits and behaviours were heretical. And that, of course, is why they wanted him dead. History teaches us, however, time and time again, that one generation's heretic often turns out to be the next generation's prophet. Take, for instance, William Wilberforce and the issue of slavery, or Martin Luther King and the long battle of the civil rights movement, or Bears Nordia, the extraordinary white South African church leader who was expelled from his denomination for his early and at the time very lonely and very costly stance against apartheid theology and practice. But it was always this way. In a story that the New Testament book of Acts tells in chapter 10 and 11, the Apostle Peter meets with and then subsequently chooses to baptize a Roman centurion called Cornelius, along with his entire family in a town called Caesarea. But Luke, the writer of Acts, then informs us that when Peter eventually returns to Jerusalem, he finds himself plunged into the centre of a huge controversy. Suspicion and criticism of him are all around. Why? Because the Jewish followers of Jesus were very keen to guard tightly the boundaries that Peter had just ignored, that he'd trodden over. And Peter's experience has been repeated over and over again throughout the centuries. All too often, those who've broken new ground for the church, like Luther, have found themselves carpeted by the guardians of so-called orthodoxy. But the truth is this: the very survival of the church is dependent on women and on men who are able to think new thoughts and devise new strategies outside the old orthodoxy. Just like Peter or Luther, Those who are ready to confront the challenges posed by today's 21st century culture shouldn't be surprised if they face misunderstanding and criticism, if they're accused of unorthodoxy and even of heresy by people who interpret their vision as something liable to undermine the moral purity and integrity of the church as they see it. And here's the deepest lesson. Faithfulness, it turns out, is not the same as tradition. Following Christ is not the same thing as doing what's always been done. In fact, sometimes it turns out to be the opposite. So I'll leave you with a couple of questions. First, what do you make of the hostility all these so-called heretics I've mentioned faced? Not just from society in general, but to our shame, from large swathes of the church. And secondly, why is it that it's only with hindsight that we seem able to recognise that these were people who had the vision to see clearly, as well as the faith, curiosity and courage to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy and to bring about that much needed change?